When you move beyond sketches and wireframes and default styles, you're going to have to start choosing and using colors. And colors in general can be overwhelming. I still find myself at times kind of overwhelmed with color choice. And in this lesson, we're going to lay the foundation for all of our color selecting needs for our future projects. So I'm going to break down RGB, hex codes, HSL, and HSB. First of all, I'm going to start with RGB. You might have already known this, but that stands for red, green, and blue. And that refers to the light colors that shoot from the back of the monitor onto your screen so you can actually see the colors. So every color that exists is some combination of red, green, and blue. So there are 255 units of color in an RGB color space, and color space is a whole different can of worms that I'm not going to get into because I barely understand it myself. But there are 255 values. So if you add 255 red, 255 green, and 255 blue, you're going to get black, the color black. And if you bring all of those down to 0, you're going to get the color white. I said that backwards. 255 of every color is white and 0 of every color is black. I should probably cut that out, but I think it's kind of funny because honestly, I still get confused by that sometimes. So don't let this overwhelm you. Remembering and using RGB codes is not very intuitive to me. So you're going to find a lot more usage of HSB and HSL color selection methods in design tools. So just look at these examples, this RGB blue color, this orange, and this green. These are going to be pretty hard to kind of make sense of that. So because these are kind of complicated, I don't really rely on RGB when I'm designing unless I'm specifically trying to pull in that value from some other color I saw somewhere else. But even then, I'm probably using hex codes or HSB. HSB is my favorite, but I'll get to that in just a minute. All right, hex codes. Hex stands for hexadecimal, which means 6 digits. So the first 2 digits are for red, second 2 digits are for green, and the third set of 2 digits is blue. So red, green, and blue inside of the hex code. And the hex code, the ranking inside of the hex code, it goes like this: 0 to 9, and then A to F. 0 is actually the absence of that color. F is going to be maximum of that color. So the hex code FF0000 is going to be maxed out red and then none of green and blue. So if you max out either the first 2, the middle 2, or the last 2, you're going to get a fully saturated version of that color. Hex codes are programmatically going to be formatted with a pound sign in front of them or a hashtag for all of the millennials out there. Your design tool is not going to require the hashtag. You're just going to need to use the numbers or the letters. So you can just type in 00000 for black and then FFFFFF for white. But there is also some hex code shorthand, and this is kind of derivative from websites and like CSS code. So if you put in shorthand for black, that would be 000. It's almost like a condensed version of that hex code. The same way for white would be FFF, and if you wanted to do red, you could do F00. And so hex codes are going to be kind of like omnipresent. You can use hex codes for anything on the web or in apps, and all of both RGB values and hex codes can both be translated to one another. So it's not like you're going to paint yourself into a corner if you use a hex code instead of an RGB value. You can always just go look inside of your design tool and see what each of those values are for that one particular color. One thing I did forget to mention on RGB, when you put that on the web, there's also RGBA, lowercase a, which stands for alpha, and that's the transparency of that color. And a lot of times when you're working on a design, sometimes you might want a fully saturated color that has transparency, and other times you might want to grab the actual hex code of what that color is at 50% on like a white background or something. But I'll dig into those examples in just a minute. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and lightness, and some tools call the L luminance or luminosity, something like that. you're going to have a hue, which is going to be a range from 0 to 360, and 0 is red and 360 is red. And then you got all of the colors in between there. And the saturation is going to be, the saturation level of that particular color of red. So 100% saturation of pure red would look just like FF0000 or R255 blue 0, green 0. HSL starts to become a little bit more of a usable color method because you can just pick a hue, and that's kind of like your hue that you can use, and then you can use varying degrees of saturation and lightness to kind of manipulate the colors in a little bit more of an intuitive way that just seems to make more sense. But with HSL, it can be a little bit confusing because the saturation range kind of does something different than the HSB saturation, and I'll show those differences. And also, the HSL color selector inside of Sketch is a little bit different than the HSL color selector inside of Figma. And at the time of this recording, Adobe XD doesn't even have an HSL selector, so there's also that. All right, that brings us to HSB, hue, saturation, and brightness. Now, HSB is my absolute favorite and go-to color selection method because it's just a lot more straightforward than either RGB or even HSL. So the H is going to be your hue spanning red, green, and blue spectrum from 0 to 360. And the S is kind of like the whiteness level. Saturation is similar to like the whiteness level, and B is for brightness, which kind of is like the blackness level, if that makes sense. So you can set your hue, and if you change the saturation to 50%, that will take out 50% of the color, and it would be very, very similar, if not exactly the same as if you were to go full red on a white background and then reduce the transparency to 50%. The only difference would be that opacity would react to whatever's behind it, whereas the saturation level in that color of the HSB would just be that color no matter where it was. And the B in HSB stands for brightness, and this is like the blackness level, so 0 to 100. So 0, if you pull the brightness level all the way down, it's going to be completely black, no matter what color you're working with. And if you go all the way up, that's going to give your fully bright, saturated color. So it's kind of like turning the lights out. Brightness, blackness, that just kind of helps me remember. So it's like color, white, and black. Now I know that Sketch and Figma and XD all support HSB, and they're all going to just behave similarly. Whereas like Sketch and Figma and HSL, they're going to be slightly different in terms of how they're visually displayed. And fun fact for all my print designers out there, CMYK is also a color option, which stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And those are the 4 colors that a printer uses when they print something, which is why you'll hear the term 4-color process as a part of the printing process, because those are the 4 colors that they use, whereas the monitor shoots out RGB light. And sometimes CMYK colors can look differently when they're printed, especially if you're using CMYK on an RGB monitor. It's just not quite possible to show the true color of what that is going to look like. That's why if you're ever going to print something in color, you have to run a proof and test it. But we're not printing anything in this lesson, so don't worry about that for now. But if you are printing something, definitely test it before you send it to the printer. Okay, so I've created this document inside of Sketch, and I've also got it inside of Figma. And what I've done here is I've created this hue chart. So you can see this is 0, 20, 40, 60. This is just kind of increments of 20 going from 0 to 100. So if I open the color selection, cycle through the hue colors here, it's just going to give me that fully saturated 100% pure amount of color. This is great if you're trying to come up with like a brand color that's really poppy, or like a call to action that's super bright and contrasty. A fully maxed out 100 saturation, 100 brightness on the hue is going to give you the biggest amount of colorful contrast you can possibly have. But there's a catch. Each one of these especially if you're comparing it with white text. So you imagine you have a big red call to action with white text. It says click here. So this is going to give you a contrast score of 4, which is plenty contrasty enough for a bold text, but it's not quite contrasty enough for like body copy. And we're going to cover color contrast and accessibility in the next lesson. But I just want to point out that a fully maxed out brightness and saturation on all of these hues is going to provide you a variety of contrasting scores. And in this example, I'm contrasting that score with the color white. But you can see orange, yellow is going to be the one that is going to provide the least amount of contrast. So you can see on this white background, if I change that 1.07 to this yellow, it's going to be really hard to see, especially if I zoom out. You're just basically not even going to be able to read that. And so each one of these has its own varying degrees with contrast in terms of white. If we were to change this to be a contrast with black score, then the scores are going to be a lot different. So if I type in, what is F? 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 0. Okay, that's yellow. And then if I do black, you can see the same color contrasted with white is going to be super duper low, and the same color contrasted with black is going to be really, really high because this number will only go up to 21. So this is a very large amount of contrast. So if you're going to use a bright yellow button for anything, or bright yellow for really anything, you're limited to darker colored text if you're going to use that with that color. And that goes the same for a lot of these, like, you know, really bright yellow to light blue colors. And you can see on the dark blue, it starts to tank pretty hard in terms of, not tank, it ends up being a lot more contrasty. So this dark blue on the white background is going to be super contrasty. So that's really dark. That's AAA, very good contrast. So you could use this for calls to action or your body copy or anything like that, and it wouldn't matter. Even at small, like 14, 12 point sizes, you'd be good with a color like that. Okay, so just to show a quick few differences between HSB and HSL, I want to show you these color blocks here. So what I'm going to do is let's make a quick copy of these. So in Figma, this is really nice because it always shows you the hex color. And then if you click on this little icon, you can choose whether you want to do hex, RGB, you can do HSL, and then HSB is what we're going to use right here. And just a quick contrast inside of Sketch, you can see that I also have the hex code available. And when I open up this color, I have HSL right here, and I can click this little area to change it to RGB or HSB. All right, so for this one, I'm going to open this up and I'm just going to change the hue. Let's change that one to 60. Let's change this one to 80. And let's do this one at 220. So that's the hue change on the HSB. Now this is going to be like, if I change this to HSL, this is exactly the same. So if I change this to 60, I change this one to 80, and this one at 220, this is the exact same. You're only changing the hue. So the H in both of these are going to change exactly the same. All right, this is where it gets a little bit different. If I change the saturation inside of an HSB, watch. So check out where this color dot is. All of these fully 100% HSB values for saturation brightness, always going to be in this top right corner. This is going to be your brightest possible corner. So if I reduce the saturation, this little guy is going to go to the left. So you can see the saturation thing going all the way down. So as long as I stay on this top X axis, I'm going to only affect the saturation. And it's only when I start going down, that's when I affect the brightness. And this is the reason why I love HSB, because the changing the saturation is always going to be going from left to right, and changing the brightness is always going to be going up and down. So it just makes sense. I don't know how else to say it. It just makes sense. It's more practical for me. So if I change the saturation level to 50%, this is the exact same color if I change the opacity to 50% on this particular red because it's on a white background. So you can tell this looks exactly the same, even though, you know, this is not transparent, but this one is. So it's just kind of that, because you're affecting the white value when you change the saturation. All right, so now I'm going to, you know, put this, say, we'll do this one at 30, and saturation for this one, let's see. No, actually, let's go increments of, we'll do 80, and then we'll do, actually, okay, 75, 50, and 25. All right, so brightness, basically going to be the same exact thing if it was on a black background. So this is 50. I actually should have done 75 right there, but I think you're getting the idea. We'll do 50 on this one. Actually, that one's at 50. Oh, that should be 25. It was looking darker, so I'm confusing myself here, but I think, you know, we're going to be all right. All right, that's 75, that's 50, and then we'll put 25 on this one. 25%. So this is going to be the same, you know, if I were to select this frame by choosing the name, and I added a background color to the frame. Where are you? Where's the background color? I think they changed that. They must have literally just changed that. You used to be able to change that to a background color, but I guess now it's a fill. Okay, didn't know that. Good to know. So if I change the fill of this frame to black, and then I start playing with the opacity, it's going to behave the same way that that brightness value does on that spectrum. Okay, so now let's check out saturation change on HSL. Let's pick one of these red squares. We'll go HSL. All right, this is kind of crazy. So look at this color wheel here. When you change it to HSL, now you have almost like a mirror image of the thing. And this is why I don't like, maybe you like this, and this, if you like this way, it's totally fine. I just gonna give you my opinion here. The 50% value to me, it's just kind of weird because it's sitting in the middle, and almost everything that I've ever done with design, it's like 0 to 100. 0 means nothing at all, and 100 means everything. You know, 0, 100%, it just makes sense to me. So using this 50% value for luminosity or luminance or lightness or whatever, it just feels weird. It feels wrong, and I don't like to use it. But it does make sense with Figma's color selector, because if you go up to 100, that is 100% lightness. And that makes sense. It goes all the way up to white. If you go all the way down with lightness, it goes to black. And that makes sense. That makes sense to me, but it's still confusing. Because watch what happens when I use saturation. Actually, I take that back. This is not as confusing because Figma's color wheel is actually correct, and saturation is still going left to right. The L value is going up and down. Okay, so Figma's is not as confusing, but let's look at Sketch's HSL selector. This one is different, and this is why it was confusing, because I used Sketch for a long time as my primary tool. So you can see this color, white is up here, black is down here, and then red is right here. And they don't have that kind of inverted color picker system the same way that they do inside of Figma. So Figma's visually makes much more sense. So if I change the saturation inside of Sketch, look what happens here. It kind of curves down at an angle. A very weird angle. And to me, this is super confusing. So maybe if Sketch's color picker for HSL values looked the same as Figma's, it wouldn't be as confusing. But I know for a fact HSB is going to look the same everywhere. So hue is always going to be the color spectrum. Saturation is always going to be left to right. And lightness or brightness is always going to be up and down. So that's why I like to use HSB. So back in HSL to the saturation change, I go down in saturation, and then right here, I go even further in saturation. And let's say we go down even further in saturation. All right, you can see what's happening here. The saturation difference in HSB versus HSL is quite the difference. The saturation, when you're changing it with HSL values, it's gonna give you like muddier colors because it's trying to kind of stay in that, it's trying to keep the white and black amount the same, and it kind of takes you into like this kind of muddy red. Sometimes this is a great way to get another version of red when you're designing. Let's say red is your primary color and you want to pick out another version of red, maybe for like a secondary call to action. Sometimes HSL can be a great way to find that other color inside of the spectrum, because if you're just using HSB to pull out white and black, then it's going to behave the same way as opacity. And that might not always be what you want. So this is the one instance where I will say that HSL has an advantage over HSB, and it kind of pulls out, just by adjusting one value, that will kind of pull out that particular color, and it kind of gives you this maybe a greater spectrum. But in general, I still don't use it, even though this is a good example. So slight differences between HSB and HSL. And I know this is extremely kind of nerdy breakdown of all these different colors, but to me, I find this fascinating. And once we get deep into this entire module and we start covering all the different little nuances of color, it'll just really help to have kind of a deep understanding of all these different selection methods, because color can be tricky. There's no easy way to say it. Like, color can be a tricky thing to handle, and some different situations might call for different color selecting methods. Sometimes I might even use, hex codes only. So color can be a pretty intense topic. That's why I have an entire module on it with lots of lessons. So we're going to dive into how to apply all of this nerdy knowledge into selecting interface pieces and colors for background colors and calls to action. All that good stuff is coming up. So for homework in this lesson, I really just want you to open up one of these files, whether it's in Sketch or Figma or XD. If you're using XD or Studio, you can always open up the Sketch file. So just get in there, and as many design tools as you have, just go through and start looking at how different things change. Pick red, blue, any random color, and look at all the full bright hue colors, and then start playing with the saturation and brightness. Just get in there and start kind of messing colors around. Maybe you come up with like a cool color palette based on some of the examples that you posted or that you're working through, and maybe post those colors so the group can check it out. But no real big assignment to review. I just want you to start getting into those nerdy details between hex, HSB, and HSL. Very light homework with this first assignment here, with this first lesson. So let's just keep moving on into the world of color.